Welcome back to GrokTALK, brought to you by the Coalition of New Hampshire Taxpayers and the bloggers at GraniteGrok.com. Check us out on Facebook, check us out on Twitter, just search for Granite Grok, and of course CNHT.org. I'd like you to know, and remember that their family picnic is next week. That's their major fundraiser of the year. You need to get some tickets. Go to CNHT.org and or pay at the door in Hillsborough, get the address, and help support them in everything they do for municipalities in the state of New Hampshire.
And the Roundy Round.
And
the Roundy Round.
The Roundy Round. We
have tickets.
Oh, yeah. I got to keep talking about that because it's unusual for us to have something to give away. Let me... Before I bring on my guest, who's waiting patiently on the phone, thank you very much. The Garcia campaign is having a Race to Congress event at Loudon, New Hampshire Motor Speedway. We're going to be giving away 2 VIP gold member passes in the last segment now. So if you are waiting to call in, please remember the phone number is 603-715-9689. Please do not call unless you can go to the event, which is tonight at 7 o'clock. And now that I've taken care of that business, let's move on to the important business of turning the music down so I can actually talk to the guest. Mark Chenoweth is the General Counsel of the Washington Legal Foundation, and he's here today to talk to us about an op-ed that he wrote in the New Hampshire Union Leader recently regarding MTBE and the New Hampshire Superior Court decision against ExxonMobil. Let me turn this little button on and turn that little button on. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me this morning.
Great to have you here. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us.
Glad to do it.
All right, so we haven't talked about this in a little bit. Why don't you preface the situation and the verdict, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, the case began over a decade ago when the state of New Hampshire hired out-of-state contingency fee attorneys to sue over a dozen oil and gas companies that manufactured gasoline containing the EPA-approved ingredient MTBE, methyl tertiary butyl ether. It does not roll off the tongue, but that's why we say MTBE. And over the course of the litigation, all but 2 of the manufacturers settled with the state, and the case went to trial then just over a year or so ago. And the last 2 companies that were in the case were Citgo and ExxonMobil. Citgo settled very early in the trial, and so by the time that the verdict was handed down, ExxonMobil was the only company remaining in the case. And the jury handed down a $236 million verdict, which was more than 10 times the size of any previous verdict in the history of New Hampshire.
Okay, so why do you think that was? What I mean, is there some foolishness afoot in the background?
Yeah, well, there usually is in these cases, and I think what was going on here, I mentioned that out-of-state plaintiffs' attorneys were hired, and the decision was made on the part of the folks bringing the lawsuit, by which I mean not just the out-of-state attorneys, but also the Attorney General's office in New Hampshire, to not go after the gas stations that owned the tanks. And maybe I should give a little more background here. I know folks have been following this issue to some degree in New Hampshire, but the way that these leaks occurred is that this ingredient in the gasoline leaked out of underground storage tanks at gas stations around the state. And the owners of those tanks would be the ones that you would ordinarily think you might go after to clean up and recover the cost of cleaning up for any spills. But that wasn't the decision that was made here. The state's hired guns decided to go after the deep-pocketed oil companies instead, even though the oil companies were following EPA rules in including MTBE in the gasoline. They were the ones that were viewed as the big ticket folks to go after. So the attorneys put the fact of pollution, or at least the accusation of pollution, in front of the jury. They put a deep-pocketed oil company in front of the jury. They claimed that they told the jury they needed over $800 million to clean up MTBE around the state, and asked for a huge verdict. They got the huge verdict, and then ever since then they've been trying to avoid spending the money on cleaning up MTBE. The reason for that is all the water utilities in the state say that the water is perfectly safe to drink. There aren't any spills that need to be cleaned up in order to ensure that the groundwater is safe. And so now we're left with the question, well, why was the state suing the companies for this huge sum of money if it wasn't actually needed for cleanup?
Mark, this is Skip Murphy, and I want to say thanks for coming on the show. And you bring up a great point where we had Kevin Arvid, who's running for the state senate here in New Hampshire, on and talking about property rights. And it always comes down to who has control and who gets the money, because oftentimes the money is the control. And your segue is great for my question is, cui bono? Who actually benefits? And, if the water departments are saying, well, the water is fine, it seems to always come down to the government at all levels is always trying to look for free money from somebody else.
Well, yeah, and I read your op-ed, Mark. This is Mike Rogers, and you note that the law mandating MTBE.
Sorry, inside joke.
Inside joke. And it's tertiary, not tetra, which is what I'd said earlier. So Mark corrects us all. Methyl tertiary butyl ether. The law mandating this stuff, which sounds a lot like a train system, is in fact or contains a feature that will pay for local cleanup if it should be necessary. So if the groundwater should actually be impacted, the water utilities can tap a fund set up by this law in order to do so. So in other words, there was no need to sue to get the money to do cleanup, and in fact the money that they got, they're not going to use for cleanup. It was in fact a simple seeking of deep pockets for a payday. Is that correct?
That's right. There's something at the federal level called the LUST Fund, which stands for the Leaking Underground Storage Tank Fund, and the LUST Fund was set up precisely because the government anticipated the possibility that there could be some leaking underground storage tanks and wanted to be sure that there were enough funds to pay for cleaning up sites when that needed to take place. And so from the very beginning, it had the gas manufacturers contributing to a federal fund in order to pay the costs. So not only is there a fund available, but by suing the oil and gas companies now, you're essentially going after them twice to pay for the same thing. And I do think that it's a grab for free money or an attempt to treat the court systems of New Hampshire as a revenue base for the state. And that's something that West Virginia and other states have done by creating jackpot justice systems, and it's driven business out of those states. And I don't think it's a path that New Hampshire wants to go down. No,
it makes me think of something else. The smell of cigarette smoke is strong in my nostrils as you describe the scheme, Mark. Because wasn't it very similar to the path that was followed with the states all clubbing together to go after the cigarette companies for a big pot of money that they could use for any purpose at the state level, even though it was ostensibly to offset the health costs?
Yes, this is the same playbook, if you will, that the tobacco plaintiffs' attorneys used. In some cases, it's the exact same law firms and same lawyers involved in those. I don't know for sure if that's the case with the specific attorneys involved in New Hampshire, but it's definitely the same playbook that was used in the tobacco litigation. And it's the strategy is to find a particular deep pocket, find some sort of story that can be told that would be compelling to a jury, demonize the defendant, and then seek a big payday. And that's something that has been was successfully modeled in the tobacco cases, and now they've tried it in several different other areas as well, including MTBE.
Mark, this is Skip again. You mentioned jackpot judiciary and said that we are, as a state, shouldn't want to go down that road. From your standpoint, are we just getting on the on-ramp? Are we speeding up to join the rest of the traffic, or are we starting to lead the pack in that way? Being a small state where there are very few deep pockets around, so when they see one, they're going to drive right to it.
Well, I would say, in some sense, leading the pack, at least when it comes to MTBE. You may have seen within the last month that both Vermont and Pennsylvania have now filed very similar lawsuits against oil and gas manufacturers. New York and New Jersey have also have ongoing. Or at least the New Jersey litigation is ongoing. The New York litigation may not still be ongoing, but I believe was started subsequent to the New Hampshire case. So there has been a trend that's been set by New Hampshire here with this litigation.
You know, we earlier in the show we were talking about qualified immunity that has just gone way too far. We also talked about private property. And are we seeing such a litigious society going after private property that is helping to obviate the rule of law and the right to private property because of just pure politics and money? You said that the producers of this stuff were well within the law. So why is it that we're going after the folks that create the gas and the additives? Why aren't we going after the individuals within the governmental schemes that approve this and strip away their qualified immunity?
Well, exactly. Before you hand it back to Mark, this was a mandated addition. In other words, they weren't just within the law, they were following the law.
Go ahead.
No, that's right. So there's a couple of aspects to that. At the federal level, the Clean Air Act mandated that an oxygenate be added to gasoline. The only oxygenate that existed in sufficient quantities at the time that the mandate initially went into effect was MTBE. So to comply with the Clean Air Act, the gasoline manufacturers had little choice but to use MTBE. And then New Hampshire separately opted into the reformulated gasoline program because it had concern about smog levels in some of the southern counties in the state of New Hampshire. And when it opted into that program, then the gasoline manufacturers had no choice but to supply gasoline that included MTBE as an ingredient to the state of New Hampshire. And so the manufacturers were complying with both state mandate and federal mandate in supplying the gasoline to the area. As I mentioned before, the owners of the filling stations, the owners of the tanks that leaked, would ordinarily be the folks that you would go after. If you mentioned private property, if your property is adjacent to the property where this has occurred, and if there's a leak and the leak comes onto your property under standard kinds of tort law or legal or your lawsuit theories, you would go after your neighbor saying, you're the one who allowed this to leak onto my property. You wouldn't go after the person who put the stuff into the tank unless they knew that the tank was leaking at the time that they put it in there. But they didn't own the tanks. They didn't have any way to monitor that. They weren't responsible for making sure in most cases that those tanks were sound.
All right, Mark, we're going to take a quick 60-second break. Stay on the line. We'll be right back.
He tried to make us believe he was a fiscal conservative, but State Senator Dave Booten has been deceiving New Hampshire taxpayers. Like a wolf in sheep's clothing, he claimed to be one of us, pretending to blend in, but all along voting like a liberal Democrat. He voted to raise your gas tax by another 23%, taking a bigger bite out of our wallets every time we're at the pump. And oh, how he drooled at the opportunity to vote to expand Obamacare, which will result in higher taxes and longer wait times in the emergency room. And now the Senate wants to pass a bill to prevent us from criticizing Senator Booten's vote? Call Senator Booten at 603-203-5391 and tell him that we're on to his wolf in sheep's clothing routine. Tell him to stop pretending to be a fiscal conservative and start voting like one. Paid for by Citizens for a Strong New Hampshire.
GrokTALK. All right, we are on the line with Mark Chenoweth, General Counsel of the Washington Legal Foundation. We're talking about the MBT. That's the inside joke.
MT is correct.
MT. The MT. We just having a heck of a time. I wrote it down, MTB, and I still can't read it right. It's just been one of those days. Mark, we've been having all kinds of technical problems this morning. I'm sorry. You've joined us here, and we're on the phone, and everything appears to be working.
The equipment is now wired correctly, but our brains are a different matter.
We're still way back on the original problem. So I wanted to ask you about, is there any appeal path for any of this? I mean, they're just stuck paying these fines?
So two different answers to that question. The companies that settled in advance of the litigation don't have an appeal path. So there was approximately $136 million from the 10 or 11 companies that settled in advance of the litigation. The company that took the case all the way to trial, ExxonMobil, the $236 million verdict against it is currently on appeal in front of the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And there are a couple of different ways in which the New Hampshire Supreme Court could find that there was a problem with that verdict. In fact, there was a verdict over $1 billion against ExxonMobil in Maryland on the same sort of MTBE theory that the Maryland Supreme Court threw out. So if you have a blue state Supreme Court like Maryland throwing out a verdict like that, by no means should the politicians in New Hampshire assume that the $236 million verdict is safe. The New Hampshire Supreme Court has yet to speak, and they could yet throw out the verdict.
So you raised two very good points in the last segment, Mark. One of them was that ordinarily the leaker, i.e. the gas station owner, would be sued by the harmed adjacent property owner, i.e. the guy whose well got polluted, or in the case of a town, maybe the town water district. Those would be the people who would have standing to sue. The second thing is, I had a question. Is MTBE, is it corrosive like ethanol? In other words, would it make its own leaks, or is it in fact inert in that respect, but just not good for groundwater?
I don't know if it has the same corrosive effects. I have heard that ethanol is worse, but I don't know if that is because MTBE is inert and ethanol isn't, or whether ethanol is just worse in that regard. I just don't know the answer to that. But I do know that MTBE is more soluble than gasoline as a whole, and so it tends to go further in a plume than other components of gasoline. But I should mention that ethanol is even more soluble, and so if ethanol had been used instead, you would have ethanol pollution in all of the same places that you have MTBE pollution now.
Just an aside, recently the same Supreme Court that's going to be ruling on this case came to the rather brilliant conclusion that a loaded gun is not loaded when it is unloaded. So you might, there is a possibility that they might see some wisdom here and go, oh yeah, this isn't really their problem. Gentlemen, more questions.
We've been talking about the gasoline additives here, but do you see any parallels to this here in New Hampshire that we should start looking for? Because as an ADD bunch of bloggers, we're always looking for more fodder to bring to the table for our conservative and libertarian readers. So is there anything else that's on your radar screen that we ought to be putting on our table?
Well, the thing I would say is that if this case is upheld, there is a new theory of liability that will be available in New Hampshire that has not really been available before. It's this market share theory of liability. If you take a look at what happened in this case, the state did not go into court and tell the jury these particular leaks occurred from these particular tanks, these particular companies' product was in the tanks, therefore we think that they should be at fault for this leak. Instead, what they did was say, here's the total cost that we estimate for cleanups statewide, and then here is the percentage to which all these various companies supply gasoline to the state. And for ExxonMobil, it's roughly 30% of the market in New Hampshire is supplied by ExxonMobil. So we're going to hold them accountable for 30% of the total cleanup cost. Now, it could be the case that none of the ExxonMobil tanks leak. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying that for purposes of what they proved in court, they didn't prove any particular leak from any particular company. They relied on this market share theory of liability. And that's something that I imagine will be trotted out in future suits, where they will try to assign liability not based on the particular bad act that any company committed, but just based on its percentage of the market. And that theory was originally devised for situations where it was impossible to tell which company was responsible. So if you had, for example, in some pharmaceutical cases, you had a number of different generic suppliers of some drug that was alleged to be causing a problem, and it was very difficult for folks to tell which one they had taken. But that's not the case here. You know which if you identify a leak, then you know which tank that leak came from, and you know which company or companies supplied gasoline to that tank over time. They just took a shortcut here and decided they didn't want to bother with that chain of proof.
Seems to me that ExxonMobil has an interesting defense. They could actually test their franchisees' tanks and say, guess what? We're not leaking. Go take a hike.
In fact, ExxonMobil said early in the litigation that they would be happy to pay for the cost of cleanup for any tanks that were specifically identified and tied to their property, to tanks that they owned, where they supplied gasoline, and the state did not take them up on that.
Mark, is this sort of the judicial analogous way of shucking off responsibility? Because, here in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts and now at the federal level, everybody's trying to raise their gas taxes. And, oh, by the way, so that we don't have to take any hard decisions or votes anymore, we're just going to peg it to the inflation rate. So they just set this in motion and let it go. Is this the judicial equivalent of that, saying, oh, if something goes wrong, we're just going to divvy it up among all of you who participate in this marketplace, instead of doing the hard work and determining, oh, by the way, here's the, out of the 1,000 places that have such, only 10 are leaking, but that's just too much work.
I do think it's a lazy way to proceed, and I think that it sets a precedent that can be abused. I think it was abused here, but I think it can be further abused down the road in other kinds of cases. It's not a theory of liability that was made for this situation, and I think it's unfortunate that the trial court allowed it to go forward here. The other thing that the trial court did that's worth noting is that it did not allow the jury to know about the existence of the leaking underground storage tank fund. So when we criticize this verdict,
isn't that special?
Yeah,
and I love the acronym, by the way, LUST, and it's the lust,
fund, exactly.
and it's the lust for money that's causing them not to use the LUST fund.
I like to say that MTBE stands for money to burn eventually, or money to burn evidently, or something like that, because that's certainly how the politicians are treating it.
Well, how do we, as activists here in New Hampshire, and we are blessed in that we are a very small state, I can literally walk down the street and slam on my representative's door if I so desired. And they know me by name. In fact, they know all of us pretty much by our first names. How do we get this to stop?
Well, I think that the key is to, and this comes back to something you were talking about before, about using this kind of thing as a revenue source. If the state is keeping spending under control, and then it's raising taxes at the level that the populace approves, then you don't need to be reaching out to these kinds of sources for additional revenue. It's not a reliable source of revenue. It's a one-time source of revenue, and it has negative consequences of I think driving folks out of the state. And for that matter, where do you think the dollars are going to come from? Do you think that the oil companies are just going to turn the money over, or do you think that the price of gasoline is going to go up in New Hampshire in the future? I think we all know that companies don't just have funds set aside to pay for these kinds of things. They have to get the money back, and it seems to me that the folks in New Hampshire already paid once when the Lust Fund was created, and the gasoline companies were contributing to that fund, and now they're going to have to pay a second time as these verdicts work their way through the system.
Well, companies don't pay fines or taxes. People do.
That's right.
All right, Mark, we're kind of coming to the end of this segment. We're going to do something in the last 5 minutes that we've been waiting to do all morning, and I wanted to thank you very much for taking time to talk to us this morning.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to let your listeners know that if they could go to the Washington Legal Foundation website, that's WLF.org, they can find out more about this topic and a lot of different topics that we work on at the Washington Legal Foundation. We have a blog called The Legal Pulse that keeps folks up to date on some of these issues, and we litigate, we advocate, and we file comments with federal and state government agencies on a lot of these different issues. And if it's something that if folks care about free market issues and want to follow them in greater detail, it's a good source for them to turn to.
All right, great, Mark. Thank you very much. You have a great weekend.
Thanks for having us.
All right, bye-bye. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to give away some VIP passes to the New Hampshire Motor Speedway Race to Congress event. If you want to give us a call at 603-715-9689, the first caller gets the tickets.
And Skip is watching the flasher.
Line 2. Make sure you get the right line. Nobody calls. That'll be embarrassing.
Well, you also got to look at it this way, too. We are also a podcast where people get to watch on their time versus our time.
Yeah, that's true. The odds of an event, we might just have to give these to somebody.
Well, that's fine. I can think of more than a few people who would be willing to go. But the problem is that it's a gorgeous day outside.
It is.
It's probably in the low 70s,
Probably
not a
outdoors.
cloud in the sky. The humidity is way down. We don't get many of these kinds of days here in New Hampshire.
Good week. Been a good week overall.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it was a good week
and
last week.
They're all outside doing yard work.
603-715-9689 if you're on the live stream and you're in the area, and you may not be. So, and like I said earlier, if you don't think you can go to the event, don't call. So that may discount a large portion of our audience. So that's okay.
Well, people just have to remember that if they're traveling in their cars, take your smartphone, come to GrokTALK.com, New Hampshire's leading conservative libertarian blog site, dial up the post, click on the live stream, and you can listen to wherever you are, even on the beach, on your lawn tractor, raking your leaves, gardening the weeds. You know, I have to go home and feed my weeds, by the way.
You have to feed your weeds.
Yes, feed the weeds.
Right. Feed the mosquitoes, feed the weeds.
Yes. But you can have us with you all the time if you so desire.
Anyway, you can call over the break as well when we do go to break. And next time, we're going to have J.R. Hole on. And we'll probably talk about SB 319. I got that right. We're done with MTBE. And
money to burn eventually. I like that acronym.
I may actually remember it now.
Yes.
Instead of thinking it's some, big mass transit boondoggle south of us.
In Boston.
In Boston.
Well, it turned out to be a transit boondoggle that the states could tap. And the Lust Fund wasn't enough for them. They had to go after the deep pockets for more money to burn eventually.
More money to burn eventually.
Phone number again is
603-715-9689. If you don't call us, maybe we'll call you.
Ooh, we got lots of numbers scattered all over here.
I know we do. We have phone numbers in abundance, and we could just give them to.
And you can
anyone
call
you
us
want.
during the break. We can still see the flasher and pick you up. You just won't be on the air while the PSAs are playing.
And that's fine. And if not, we're gonna hold a little in studio raffle and decide who to give them to. And of course, it cod be somebody here. It won't be me, though. I have another event to go to. So, all right. My name's Steve McDonald. I am here with Skip Murphy and Mike Rogers. We'd like to thank Mark Chenoweth for his time. And he was with the Washington Legal Foundation. And we will be right back with J.R. Hole.
And you can get them at WLF.org.
Correct. Thank you, sir.
When asked whether she still supports Obamacare, Senator Jeanne Shaheen said,
"Yes, I do continue to support the law. We're beginning to see some positive results."
How can Senator Shaheen say we're seeing positive results when 22,000 of our neighbors have already lost their health insurance? What's worse, the Boston Globe reports the state's only health insurance provider radically reduced the number of hospitals in their network, forcing some people to drive over an hour for lab work, even when there's a hospital within a few miles of their home. When pressed about lack of access, Shaheen said,
There are some hospitals that are not covered, unfortunately, and I certainly hope that's going to change.
Jeanne Shaheen promised us we could keep our doctors and our healthcare coverage. Now she hopes we can get to a local hospital? Call Senator Shaheen at 603-647-7500. Tell her we need more than hope. We need leadership. Paid for by Citizens for a Strong New Hampshire.
Senator Jeanne Shaheen said, if you like your current health plan, you can keep it. That's not true, Senator. 22,000 New Hampshire citizens have been kicked off their insurance plans. Hospitals in Rochester, Concord, and Portsmouth, they aren't allowed to provide care under the exchange. Senator, you were wrong in your comments. You should apologize for your misleading remarks. I'm calling Senator Shaheen at 750-3004 and telling her I want my doctor back. You should too.
Paid for by SaberPac.org, not authorized by any candidate or candidate committee.
GrokTALK is a production of GraniteGrok.com in cooperation with a coalition of New Hampshire taxpayers. Individual guests and speakers are responsible for their own content, and their opinions are not necessarily those of CNHT, Granite Grok, or anyone else for that matter. Grok TV.